Do you like tales of murder, betrayal, and sexual depravity? If the answer is yes, then seek help. Seriously though, we at A Day in History find these twisted tales fascinating too, which is why we bring them to you. Today's video will tell you about the short life of one of the most depraved and amoral men you'll ever read or hear about. Of course, history is full of sociopathic people who terrorize those around them and those around the globe. However, the man we will tell you about today was more of a boy, for he was only 18 when he was elected to one of the most powerful positions in the world. He wasn't like Hitler, Stalin, or any of the totalitarian leaders of recent times. But what makes his behavior and crimes even more shocking is that he was the Pope. If you like this type of content, and you do since you're here and have watched so far, please like this video when you've finished watching and subscribe to our channel for more disgusting and depraved content. Bless you! A brief history. Sadly, there isn't anything all that new about popes who have strayed from the path. In recent years, the sexual abuse scandals of the 20th and 21st centuries have made headlines the world over and tarnished the reputation of the papacy and of the Catholic Church as a whole. Despite public statements in World War II, Pope Pius XII tolerated and even dealt with the evil dictators Mussolini and Hitler. Further back, the popes from the powerful Medici family of Florence, Italy, bankrupted the church with their wild spending on food, parties, art, and more, all of which played a considerable role in the division of the church, beginning with the Protestant Reformation of the 1500s. The Catholic Church recognizes the Christ's disciple Peter as the first pope. Our sick Pope, John XII, is considered the 130th pope by many, though it wasn't until the 37th Pope, Damasus, in 366 that Christianity was declared the official religion of Rome by the Emperor Theodosius I. That was when the official title of the popes, Pontifex Maximus, was given up by the emperor and given to the men who would lead the Catholic Church from that point forward. Pontifex Maximus means greatest bridge builder in Latin, for the man was supposed to build bridges not only between people, but between God and humanity. Today's Pope Francis is the 266th Pope. Popes were elected by the people. Our Pope, John XII, ruled over Western Christendom from 955 to 963, some 600 years after Pope Damasus. Damasus had been appointed by the Emperor Theodosius, but by the time of John XII, popes were elected by the people of Rome. Well, that's kind of misleading, for while the people of the city did vote for the Pope, the vast majority of those votes were bought by powerful families who either had a son or other family member running for the position. Essentially, the position of Pope went to the highest bidder. What's more, the candidates for the position were oftentimes not exactly paragons of virtue. As a matter of fact, some of them, like John XII, did not know or care much about religion at all. What many popes and their backers cared about was power, and in the Middle Ages, the Pope was considered infallible. In other words, he could make no mistakes, at least as far as it concerned most people. Kings and emperors were another matter, and at many times in history, the popes were tools of those who held military power. The Pope, however, held the balance, for winning the Pope over to your side was costly. In return for his support, rulers often had to pay bribes, give up land, and at least to some degree, listen to what the Pope suggested, for the Pope had the ultimate weapon: excommunication. Being excommunicated meant that a person was no longer able to take part in church rites. The practices such as Holy Communion, confession, and attending Mass. Without these rites and practices, a person could not ever ascend to heaven, and could not, at least in theory, associate with any Christian, and all of the Christians in Western Europe at the time were Catholic. The Pope had tremendous power. John XII. Before he took his papal name of John, he was known as Octavianus. His father, the powerful ruler of Rome, Duke Alberic II, named him after the first Roman emperor Octavian, also known as Augustus, for Alberic wanted his son to follow him not only as the political leader of Rome, but as Pope. Alberic's family, the Tusculum clan, had ruled the area for decades. They were rich, powerful, and respected, and Alberic himself was well loved. After his death in 954, the rich and powerful in Rome made certain that Octavianus was elected pope, and the 18-year-old became one of the most powerful and richest men in the world as John XII. On becoming pope, most men only used their regnal or papal name, but in John XII's case, his rule over Rome was both religious and secular. He issued order under his real name when acting as political leader and as John when acting as pope. Perhaps this sort of dual identity contributed to the Pope's keeping one foot firmly planted on earth during his papacy, for not much of what he did as Pope could be called heavenly. Even back then, popes were expected to at least appear to be holy and above human concerns, but oftentimes John would skip out on his duties and his lessons. He had to take lessons, for he had no idea what was really expected of the Pope and how to run the church. But many times, John would take off for the woods with a bunch of his friends and a barrel or two of wine and go hunting. In the time before firearms, hunting was an even bloodier affair than it is now, with prey killed by spear, sword, arrow, or packs of dogs. Pope John would often return to the Vatican days later, covered in dirt and blood, hungover and exhausted. Those inside the church, the College of Cardinals, and the bishops in attendance were shocked by this kind of behavior. But John was just getting started. 5 years after becoming pope, John decided that he wanted to be a warrior as well as a hunter. At the time, most rich and aristocratic young men were given some training in the art of war, but that did not necessarily make them a good general. In 960, John led an army to take back territory in northern Italy that had once been controlled by the Vatican, or as John's government as pope was known, the Papal States. The rulers of Beneveneto and Capua that he marched against had not only taken papal land, but were powerful rivals of John's family. The opposing rulers, outnumbered by John and not wild about the idea of actually going to war against the Pope, secured the help of another powerful leader in southern Italy, Gisulf of Salerno, who threatened Rome from that direction. Outnumbered and outplayed, John was forced to give in and guaranteed Gisulf that he would not enforce papal rule over his territory. While this happened, another powerful leader, King Berengar II, who ruled much of the Italian peninsula, decided that if John was going to act like a general and king and try to take land for his own, then he would be treated like any other rival. Berengar was powerful and John needed help. The only man powerful enough to fend off Berengar was King Otto I of Germany, who wanted the title given to the great Emperor Charlemagne in 800. Holy Roman Emperor, which would make him a very powerful man and the nominal political ruler of all of Europe. When Otto agreed to help John, the Pope made all kinds of public and solemn promises to Otto, all in the name of God. Not something you can easily go back on, but John eventually would. Before that, however, he crowned Otto as Holy Roman Emperor in exchange for Otto's military protection. We'll get back to Otto's relationship with John in a moment. Pope John's other relationships. It's important to remember that before the 1100s, it was not forbidden for priests and popes to marry, and it was not unusual for a pope, whether he was married or single, to have a mistress. The thing was, it was to be kept quiet and low-key. Some popes were low-key, others were definitely not, and definitely had more than one mistress or two or three. John came from a long line of degenerates, especially on his paternal grandmother's side. Duke Alberic I's wife, Marozia, had been the power behind the throne of the Dukes of Rome for years before the birth of John. Marozia was the mistress of Pope Sergius III, who was a close family friend. They had a son together who later became Pope John XI, but not before she had had Pope John X murdered in 928 so that she could have her own son elected as Pope. John XI was not the son of Alberic, even though Marozia was married to him at the time. He was Pope Sergius' son. Before John X was of age, there was a swift succession of popes, two of whom Marozia had put on the throne through her money and influence. She also had Pope John X murdered in 928 to make room for her illegitimate son. Marozia married another powerful man, Hugh of Spoleto, after the death of her first husband. Hugh hated Alberic II and once beat him publicly. Eventually, Alberic II had Hugh killed and his mother Marozia imprisoned for the rest of her life. John XII's mother was Alda, his father's stepsister and wife. This was the family situation that John XII was born into in 937. Having had such wonderful role models and becoming one of the richest and most powerful men in the world at 18, John began a quite irreligious lifestyle. He certainly traded in on his position of pope, for he soon began to sleep with as many women as he could, many of them married and many of them the wives of powerful men in Rome. He undoubtedly told these women that it was God's will that they sleep with him, and that after having done so would be sanctified by the Almighty as well. Being the Pope and being considered infallible by Catholics, these women likely believed every word he told them. John also slept with one of his now deceased father's mistresses and had a child by her. Another mistress he named as governor of one of the papal cities and gave her all of his father's remaining wealth. It's reported that he also had attractive female pilgrims to Rome kidnapped or bribed to have sex with him in the Lateran Palace, the Pope's residence, sometimes more than one at a time. How John had the time for all of this in the midst of the trouble he was in from outside the Vatican is a mystery. What is known though is that aside from being a degenerate, John was also an oath breaker and betrayer. John's position was made possible by his military support from the powerful Otto I of Germany. Without it, John's political enemies outside the Vatican would soon move on him again. Meanwhile, many inside the Vatican were disgusted and disillusioned by John's behavior and reckless spending. It's believed that John had nearly bankrupted the Vatican by the time he died. After throwing his support behind John, Holy Roman Emperor Otto I stayed in Rome for a time. During that time, he had hoped to be a tutor for the young man, instructing him on politics and diplomacy. However, Otto was repulsed by John's behavior and told the Pope that it would be better for him and the Church if he behaved properly. John was also angered by what he thought was Otto's tone. He believed the emperor talked to the Pope as if he were a small child. What Otto got for his troubles was John's almost immediate betrayal. No sooner had Otto left Rome than the Pope once again began to have sex with every woman he wanted, drinking and gambling with the Church's money. Otto was in northern Italy and received a message from one of his men in Rome. The Palace of the Lateran, which had once sheltered saints, was now a harlot's brothel. Remember, this was the early Middle Ages. Vikings were raiding northern Europe at the time. It was not a time when the rich and powerful cared much about morals or how they were perceived. So when Otto first got this message, he chalked it up to the Pope's youth and believed that given time and instruction, John XII would learn how to be a man and a good Pope. But when Otto got word of John's other activities, the emperor changed his tune. John was discovered to be in talks with Aldebert, the son of King Berengar, Otto's enemy. John was also found to be in contact with the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople and with Berengar himself. Why? Because after witnessing Otto's power, John was beginning to feel upstaged and was planning Otto's overthrow. There was even a rumor that John had agreed to make Aldebert the new Holy Roman Emperor. For Otto, that was enough. He marched back down to Rome with a large army. When word of Otto's approach reached John, he fled the Vatican, taking as much gold, jewels, wine, and women as he could. Aldebert went with him. When Otto reached Rome, he ordered a meeting, or synod, of high church officials to make a list of John's crimes and to depose him as pope. These included blinding his confessor, having arranged the castration and murder of a cardinal, imitating the Roman Emperor Nero, and setting parts of Rome ablaze, all the while parading around dressed as a soldier in armor, toasting Satan at parties, invoking Roman gods for luck while gambling, hunting, taking bribes to make men bishops, ordaining a 10-year-old boy as bishop, and more. Later, church historians and critics also accused him of incest. Otto and the Synod then ordered John back to Rome to face these charges. He refused, wisely for him. Moreover, he wrote Otto a message rejecting his demands, excommunicating and declaring that Otto and the Synod could not elect a new pope. But on December 1st, 863, they did so anyway. Unfortunately, John was of Rome, and the people at the very populous and prosperous city believed they had elected him freely. They rioted against Otto and the new Pope Leo VIII. It is the Middle Ages. Otto slaughtered as many of the rioters as he could, and they dispersed for a while. When Otto left to attend to his other lands in January 864, John returned to Rome, fired up his supporters, and wrought a terrible vengeance on everyone who had supported Otto and Leo VIII, who had fled soon after John's return to the city. John's victims were tortured and then killed. Noses and fingers were cut off, tongues cut out, men castrated, and much more. Then, having re-established control of Rome, John called together a group of his supporters in the church, excommunicated Leo VIII, and invalidated his election. It was likely only a matter of time before Otto would return to Rome and take care of John. But before that happened, John XII, considered the worst pope in history by many, died. There are two stories about John's death, both equally fitting. The first story has John having a fatal stroke while having sex with yet another married woman. The other has John dying from internal bleeding resulting from the same woman's husband beating the Pope to death or throwing him from a high window. Either way, John XII, the most corrupt of many corrupt popes, died on May 14, 964. The Catholic Church has had its fair share of awful popes, and few deserve to be on that list like Sixtus IV. Sixtus sullied the papacy with corruption, nepotism, and political scheming, as well as creating one of the most feared institutions in all of human history. In this video, we delve into the life of Pope Sixtus IV and the unspeakable deeds that earned him his fierce reputation. Born Francesco della Rovere in July 1414, the future Pope Sixtus IV came from a relatively poor family. At a young age, he joined the Franciscan order where his charisma and intelligence were quickly revealed. He spent his youth learning what he could about philosophy and theology at the University of Pavia. He wrote influential treatises on Thomas Aquinas and the Immaculate Conception, but it would be his traveling lectures across Italy that cemented his reputation as one of the leading men of the Franciscan order. His travels brought him into contact with many of Italy's most powerful men, including the Duke of Milan and countless cardinals, who would one day help raise him to incredible power. Although he gave himself to his religious work, Francesco never forgot his family. Thanks to several siblings, Francesco ended up with many nephews who he treated almost as his own sons, educating them and working to advance their social position. The most important of these nephews were Girolamo and Pietro Diario, from his sister's marriage into the Diario family, along with Giuliano and Giovanni della Rovere from his brother. Francesco would craft all of them into tools to further the family's goals and his papal ambition. Eventually, Francesco's work and connections paid off when he was selected as Minister General of the Franciscan Order in 1464, and he finally became a cardinal in 1467 by appointment of Pope Paul II. However, Pope Paul died unexpectedly in 1471. Francesco rolled the dice and finally had cause to exploit the assets he had built. His lectures and written works had already endeared him to the College of Cardinals that selected the next pope. With the support of the Duke of Milan, who he'd met some years prior during his travels, and well-placed promises from his nephews to reward the cardinals who voted for him, Francesco secured his election to the papacy. He was crowned under the name Sixtus IV in St. Peter's Square on August 25, 1471, beginning a reign that would upend Italian politics and reshape Catholicism for centuries to come. Upon becoming pope, Sixtus abused his new position to shower gifts on his family. Within a year, Sixtus's sisters had elaborate houses in Rome and every luxury they desired. His nephews, Pietro and Giuliano, were immediately made cardinals despite being completely unqualified for the position. Pietro was made a bishop and then the Archbishop of Florence in 1473. Pietro was close to his uncle and effectively ran Sixtus's foreign policy until his sudden death later in 1473. Meanwhile, Giovanni was made the lord of papal lands in Senigallia and Mondavio and given a favorable marriage to a daughter of the powerful Montefeltro family. But perhaps the most richly rewarded nephew was Girolamo Riario, who was made captain general of the church, effectively in full control of the papacy's military resources, and was made the Lord of Imola, a recently acquired city that would cause a cascade of problems in time. He was also married off to the daughter of the Duke of Milan, and in 1480 was made the Lord of the city of Forli as well. Thanks to Sixtus's nepotism, no fewer than 6 of his nephews were made cardinals. Sixtus also poured honors onto other friends and allies, such as his friend Francesco Salviati, who was made the Archbishop of Pisa. In fact, of the 34 cardinals created during his papacy, almost none of them were properly qualified. This corruption did not go unnoticed. Stefano Infessura, a prominent critic who lived in Rome during Sixtus's reign, wrote a scathing description of the man. He was, quote, an impious and unjust king who had no fear of God, no love of governing the Christian people, with no affection for charity or love, only caring for dishonest pleasure, greed, and vanity. Infessura had his own theories for why Sixtus appointed so many cardinals. According to rumors, Sixtus was a closeted homosexual who gave out cardinal positions to his illicit lovers. There's no solid evidence, but most historians agree that this was a widespread belief among his critics at the time. Outside of his nepotism and private life, Sixtus showed an eagerness for power. For example, he had a serious disagreement with the King of France over the king's insistence that all papal decrees needed his royal assent before being obeyed in France. Sixtus thirsted for the glory of the old papacy, whose power was unchallenged and extensive. The glory days of the Crusades were long gone, but that didn't stop Sixtus calling for them multiple times. His efforts produced unremarkable results. He also wanted to be the Pope to reunite Catholicism with the Orthodox East, another papal pipe dream that was never going to work. And once again, his lofty ambitions came to nothing, and he achieved no meaningful progress towards that goal. It seemed that Sixtus pursued his own ego and dreams of a glorious papacy before anything else, and every time met with disappointment. To his credit, Sixtus proved a far better ruler of Rome than of the Catholic Church. Sixtus's road pavements and bridge works significantly improved the city's infrastructure, and he had dozens of churches restored throughout the city. Sixtus was also a true patron of the Renaissance, acting as a patron to a number of scientists and artists, including Botticelli. He extended this support for knowledge abroad, such as in Sweden, where he approved the creation of the country's first university in Uppsala. In the Vatican itself, he commissioned so much work on the Vatican Library that he became known as its second founder. But his greatest legacy was in the elaborate chapel he had built and named after himself, the Sistine Chapel. While Michelangelo's iconic ceiling painting wouldn't come until years after his death, the Sistine Chapel was still a marvel of art and architecture, and an enduring monument to Sixtus's investment in Rome. However, this work cost money that Sixtus raised in 2 main ways. First, he sold indulgences, allowing people to buy their way out of sin. Second, he committed simony, the selling of priestly offices. Both of these were blatantly corrupt but hardly new for the Catholic Church at the time. Sixtus's corruption wasn't unique on this front, but it was symptomatic of the pervasive corruption that had consumed the Church by the late 15th century. One of Sixtus's most famous acts began in an unexpected place: Spain. By the 1470s, Spain had been unified by the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Centuries of Muslim control of the region was ended by the Reconquista, leaving a large population of Muslims and Jews in the new Catholic kingdom. This inevitably produced social tension, which the monarchs were eager to resolve. They wanted to create social stability, and they felt the only way to do that was to ensure a clear separation between the different faiths and prevent the spread of heretical ideas to Christians. The Catholic Church already had an old provision that could do just that, and Spain would seek its resurrection. They asked the Pope for an inquisition. On the 1st of November 1478, at the request of Ferdinand and Isabella, Pope Sixtus IV issued a papal bull to create the legendary Spanish Inquisition. The Inquisition had sweeping powers to detain, interrogate, and torture people on the slightest accusation. This fell particularly hard on Spain's Jews, who were already subject to intense anti-Semitism. Word of the Inquisition's cruel tortures spread quickly, and Sixtus was forced to distance himself from them in 1482. He revoked some of their powers and pursued tighter church control over their actions. But whether he was truly disturbed by their actions or he just wanted to take more control is up for debate. Although nominally loyal to the Pope, the Inquisition was truly under the command of the Spanish crown, and Sixtus and Ferdinand spent 1482 locked in a battle of wills over who should exert more control over it. In the end, Ferdinand won out, and the Pope was forced to back down on all of his criticisms out of fear that Ferdinand would permanently break the Inquisition away from papal power. Sixtus also agreed to consolidate all of the Inquisition under a single leader that he approved of, Tomás de Torquemada. In exchange, Sixtus and Ferdinand reconciled, and the king withdrew his threats to end papal authority over the organization. Torquemada became Inquisitor General of the Spanish Inquisition and turned the Inquisition's actions up to 11. Torquemada would burn over 2,000 people and torture countless more in his zealous attempt to stamp out heresy in Spain. More importantly for Sixtus, though, his authority had been preserved and all of his complaints vanished. Sixtus wrote to Torquemada after he began his work, praising him for having, quote, directed your zeal to those matters which contribute to the praise of God and the benefit of the Orthodox faith. It seems that he had never truly been bothered by torture at all, so long as the people doing it acknowledged his authority. The Inquisition would endure for years. In 1492, it was Torquemada and the Inquisition that spearheaded the expulsion of all Jews from Spain. That same year, Columbus would reach the Americas, where the Inquisition would soon earn its more fearsome reputation as a vicious persecutor of non-Christians and a key player in the destruction of Native American cultures during Spanish colonization. But Sixtus did most of his meddling in Italy itself. In order to raise his nephew Girolamo Riario to a sufficient level to marry the Duke of Milan's daughter, Sixtus had to acquire the city of Imola. However, this put him at odds with a dangerous man, Lorenzo de' Medici. The Medici were a powerful Florentine banking family who acted as the papacy's main bankers. When Sixtus sought a loan to purchase Imola, the Medici refused. Furious, Sixtus went to a rival Florentine family, the Pazzi, and began using them as his primary bankers instead. Between the disagreement over Imola and the banking change, Sixtus and the Medici were at each other's throats. Things weren't helped when Lorenzo fiercely opposed the appointment of Sixtus's friend, Francesco Salviati, yet another powerful Florentine, as Archbishop of Pisa. Clearly, the Medici were a thorn in the side of the papacy and its allies, and something had to be done. That something became known as the Pazzi conspiracy. Around 1477, Salviati, Jacopo de' Pazzi, and Girolamo Riario became the ringleaders of a plot to eliminate the Medici and take control of Florence. Meetings were held in the Vatican as the men considered how to carry out their scheme. Sixtus tried to keep his distance, but he was fully aware of what was being done. He was quoted as saying, "I want that government taken from Lorenzo's hands, because he's a villain and a wicked man. Once he's out of Florence, we'll be able to do as we wish." Reportedly, Sixtus's only stipulation was that no one would be killed. However, there was no way it could be bloodless. Sixtus must have known that when the conspirators began talking out their plans and arranging for a mercenary army to support their coup. They sprung their plot on Sunday, 26th of April, 1478, as Lorenzo and his brother were attending Mass at Florence Cathedral. The conspiracy was a chaotic disaster. Although they killed Lorenzo's younger brother, the wounded Lorenzo escaped. Alas, not with the help of any mysterious assassins, and Florence became a battlefield. Dozens of people died in street fighting as armed soldiers and the populace rose up, not, as the plotters hoped, against the Medici, but against the plotters. By the end of the day, the conspirators were defeated. Dozens were dead or captured, and many more would follow as Lorenzo hunted down those who fled. Salviati and Jacopo de' Pazzi were both killed, although Girolamo himself was not present. Sixtus was furious. After the survivors exposed the Pope's involvement, Sixtus excommunicated Lorenzo and the entire Florentine leadership and placed the whole city under interdict, meaning they weren't allowed to take Mass or communion. Florence responded carefully, publishing and circulating the confessions of the conspirators that implicated the Pope, but not going too far and risking being accused of attacking the papacy. Still, Sixtus's actions effectively legitimized any and all aggression against Florence. Shortly after, Sixtus's ally, the King of Naples, launched an invasion of Florence, starting a war that inflicted suffering and death on both sides. However, Sixtus had underestimated Lorenzo. Through bold diplomacy, Lorenzo managed not only to make peace, but to ally himself with the King of Naples. Sixtus had been thwarted. His plot had failed, Lorenzo had turned the papacy's allies into Florence's, and the Medici were more powerful than ever. Seeking to compensate for a clear loss, Sixtus navigated the complex web of Italian relations and settled on an alliance with Venice. Venice was an old enemy of Naples and had its eye on the city of Ferrare, ruled by a relative of Naples' king. The Pope and Venice joined forces to take the city, which prompted Naples, Milan, Bologna, and other cities to form a coalition against them. While Venice besieged the city, Sixtus's forces fought Naples. Eventually, Sixtus's field commander died and his war effort collapsed. Faced with his shattered pride, a coalition of hostile Italian cities, and Florence still furious at him, Sixtus was running out of options. Worse still, Venice was doing surprisingly well, and Sixtus began to fear that Venice might emerge from the war much more powerful than it began and could be a threat. So, Sixtus stabbed them in the back. Sixtus made peace with Naples and allowed their forces to head to Ferrare to fight off the Venetians. Sixtus demanded the Venetians surrender, and when they refused, he placed them under interdict too. Nevertheless, Venice endured. Sixtus sat the rest of the war out as Venice surprisingly held its own against the alliance. Eventually, peace was made with the Treaty of Bagnolo on August 7, 1484. Venice didn't take Fadare, but they kept much of the territory they had taken and were now more powerful than they'd ever been. The papacy was not invited to the negotiations, and when he heard the terms, Sixtus was apoplectic. Not only had Sixtus been embarrassed with the Pazzi conspiracy in this war, but he'd made enemies of Florence, Naples, and Venice, all of whom were more powerful now than when they began, and he had shattered whatever respect the rest of Italy had for him. Less than a week after the treaty was signed, on August 12, 1484, Sixtus died at the age of 70. Some sources blame his death on the stress caused by the treaty, but it's impossible to know. Pope Sixtus IV embodied everything wrong with the medieval Catholic Church. He was unapologetically corrupt, nepotistic, and politically ambitious. Beautiful as the Sistine Chapel and his works in Rome might have been, they represented the worldly extravagance of the Church and were paid for by selling church offices and the forgiveness of sin for mere gold. The Spanish Inquisition, which he founded, would become an infamous symbol of persecution across the world, and his scheming plunged Italy into war. He did succeed in helping some of his family. His nephew Giuliano would even become pope in 1503, but it came at tremendous cost for everyone else. It's no surprise that when Martin Luther published his 95 Theses and kickstarted the Protestant Reformation, his complaints against the Catholic Church feel like a list of criticisms of Sixtus himself. That's no surprise, since Luther was born mere months before Sixtus died, and would have grown up hearing tales of the misdeeds of his corrupt and controversial papacy. John XII was a power and money-hungry sex addict who lied to almost every ally he had and nearly bankrupted the Catholic Church. Bad, huh? Well, get ready because John wasn't the only lousy pope. Let's meet Benedict IX, one of the youngest popes in history and the only man to ever be pope twice. When a historian writes the Church, he or she only means one thing: the Catholic Church. For many hundreds of years, the Catholic Church was really the only Christian church in Europe, or at least in Western, Central, and Northern Europe. In Russia and the Byzantine Empire, which included much of the Balkan Peninsula, the Orthodox faith held sway. Both the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church in Constantinople worked tirelessly to make theirs the only Christian church. But despite much bloodshed and treasure spent, neither one could gain the upper hand in the other's territories. You see, aside from being religious leaders with great power and influence, the popes and patriarchs were often men who wielded great political power as well. For many centuries in the West, the Pope controlled not only the Vatican and the Church, but was the political chief of what were known as the Papal States, a swath of land across Italy from Rome to the Adriatic Sea. At times, the Papal States shrunk in size due to a weak pope or military defeat, and at times, the Church's land in Italy grew. Aside from this, the popes controlled the Church, and to varying degrees, depending on distance, influence, and politics, received money in the form of tithes and other payments from the churches and cathedrals throughout Western Europe. In other words, the Church was incredibly rich, at least for much of history. That meant that the Pope, as head of the Church, was incredibly rich too. In our most recent video about the papacy, we told you of the man many consider the worst pope in history, John XII. Among the many things that John did was nearly bankrupt the Catholic Church. Think about that for a moment. Today, the Catholic Church is worth billions and billions of dollars. It was not much different when John was Pope, and he spent, or allowed to be spent, nearly all the Church's money. A large part of these expenditures were spent on military campaigns, booze, women and gambling, all decidedly un-pope things. In the early 11th century, another pope did his best to take the title of worst pope in history away from John XII. Though their reigns as pope were separated by 100 years, Pope John XII and Benedict were members of the same extended family, the Tusculum clan of Rome, who liked to brag that they had been related to the Caesars. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't, but they were powerful in the early Middle Ages. So powerful that they could, and did, get popes elected and appointed. If you saw our video on John XII, you know that in his time, the people of Rome, not the College of Cardinals or a panel of bishops, elected the Pope. The people of Rome were easy to bribe, and the many families vying to put one of their own on the papal throne spent huge sums of money to do just that. If they succeeded, the payoff was huge, but for at least a century, the leaders of the Tusculum clan were the power brokers in Rome. When a pope takes office, he selects a papal name. Benedict comes from the Latin word for blessed, but Benedict's real name was Theophylactus, which means either the guardian of God or guarded by God. Either way, with a name like that and a family like his, Benedict seemed almost destined to be pope, and he was, 3 times. Benedict was the only man in history to hold the office of pope on more than one occasion. More about that in a moment. By the way, Theophylactus is not as an unusual name as you might think. Throughout the Spanish-speaking world, the name Theophilo or forms of it are still quite popular. Benedict was born around 1012. His father was Alberic III, Count of Tusculum. John XII's father was Alberic II. Aside from his distant relative Pope John XII, Benedict was nephew to 2 other popes, Benedict VIII, 1012 to 1024, and John XIX, 1024 to 1032. After the death of John XIX, Alberic and the Tusculums spread their money around in Rome and succeeded in having Theophylactus, now Benedict, elected pope. Okay, so we all know that the winners write history, and in the end, Benedict IX was not a winner. During and after his papacies, the enemies of Benedict and the Tusculum clan launched a smear campaign against him. You think the politicians of today use smear tactics and name-calling? Okay, they do, and it's pretty bad, but so far they have not accused a pope of bestiality, and that's what many of Benedict's none-too-friendly biographers have said about him, among other things. Benedict's first time as pope lasted for 12 years, a decent period, unless you're a pope whose term in office is life. And since Benedict became pope around the age of 20, he had a good stretch of time as pontiff ahead of him, even considering the shorter lifespans of the Middle Ages. During those 12 years, Benedict partied like it was 1999, or rather 1099. It's a song by Prince, check it out. He angered or offended just about everyone in Rome at one time, and that took some doing, for despite being the center of the Catholic world, Rome was known for its relatively liberal lifestyles. However, it was becoming increasingly common for priests and other clerics to take a vow of celibacy. Chastity did not become church doctrine until the later 1000s, when Pope Gregory VII commanded it. Even then, many priests, bishops, and popes ignored the policy. So, Benedict was not required to remain chaste, but it was encouraged by the church. He didn't care. Moreover, it's widely believed that Benedict was homosexual, or at the very least bisexual. Even that was not as unusual as you might think. Well, it was for a pope, but generally speaking, if a man kept things to himself and out of the public eye, homosexuality was tolerated, except when it wasn't. For instance, when the church or some political leader decided to denounce it and persecute anyone who engaged in it. Among the military class in Rome, even after the fall of the empire, homosexuality was relatively common, but not among popes. Other pontiffs had engaged in relations with other men, such as Julius II, Paul II, Sixtus IV, Leo X, and Julius III. But these men had long-standing relationships with other men, except for Paul II, who was rumored to have died while having sex with a page. Benedict was rumored to have engaged in it openly, randomly, and with more than one at a time. This was one of the main reasons why Benedict had so many enemies. In more recent times, some historians have suggested that Benedict was the victim of a smear campaign only, and that his homosexuality or his homosexual acts were alleged and never proved. But even these historians agreed that Benedict was not a shining example of moral rectitude. In 1036, after 4 years as pope, Benedict's enemies, who accused him not only of homosexuality but of orgies with both men and women, single and married, became so threatening that he was forced from Rome. Think about it for a moment. It's not an easy thing to force the pope from Rome. He is considered the representative of Christ on earth and infallible. Moreover, the people of Rome elected him, at least through the bishops. So there must have been something to the rumors, at least to a degree. Benedict sought the help of the powerful military defender of the Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III, who ushered him back into Rome, forcibly removed some of Benedict's enemies, and placed him back in the Vatican. In September 1044, the rumors of Benedict's rampant sexual escapades, including adultery, orgies, homosexuality, and bestiality, forced him out of Rome. He was replaced by Sylvester III, who was pope for just 2 months before Benedict gathered military forces and marched on the city. Sylvester and his supporters wisely fled, and in April 1045, Benedict was pope again. Benedict may have been many things, but he wasn't stupid. In only 1 month, he decided to give up the papacy again, and he doubted he had the strength to resist them. What's more, he planned on marrying his first cousin. Though this wasn't unusual then and is legal in some US states and countries today, it was not something that popes did. Not wanting to leave the Vatican cheaply, in May 1045, Benedict entered into negotiations with his priest and godfather, who became Pope Gregory VI after Benedict sold the position to him for 1,000 pounds of silver and a guarantee that he would receive the tithes of Great Britain as a salary. Even though this was unheard of, the new pope was welcomed, mainly because he wasn't Benedict. A year later, Benedict decided that retirement wasn't for him. Maybe it was the power. Perhaps it was the sex. Maybe his marriage didn't work out. History books are silent about this. Maybe he spent all of his money partying. Perhaps he wanted to issue himself a pardon. So he gathered a small army once again and marched on Rome. Though he took over the Vatican and ran things for a year, it was his godfather that everyone recognized as the real pope. The other former pope, Sylvester III, claimed that he had been illegally deposed and was still the pope himself. By this time, Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III had died, and Henry III took his place. Political figures and clergy from all over Europe begged Henry to do something about the situation in Rome, and he did. Henry called together the Council of Sutri in December 1046. Henry encouraged Gregory VI to give up the position he had bought from Benedict, for purchasing and selling church offices was a sin known as simony. He also deposed Benedict and Sylvester III with the support of important bishops. While Sylvester was at the Council of Sutri and had no choice but to give in, Benedict was not present and sent messages to Sutri, refusing to give up the Vatican. No matter, Henry III had thousands of troops. Benedict did not. Henry placed Clement II on the papal throne. Unfortunately, Clement II died in October 1047, after less than 2 years in office. Guess what? I'll bet you know. Benedict came back. He seized the Pope's residence, the Lateran Palace, and proclaimed himself Pope for a 3rd time. It took 9 months for Henry III to cross the Alps with another army and forcibly remove Benedict again. In his place was the popular Damasus II. Benedict was tried for simony and excommunicated from the church, never to return. No one knows what happened to Benedict after his third time as pope. Surprisingly, he wasn't jailed or burned at the stake or some other nasty medieval method of execution. Instead, it's widely believed that he exiled himself to the small town and monastery of Grottaferrata, southeast of Rome, where he repented for his sins and died around 1056. Benedict might have died a lonely penitent monk, but at least he had some exciting memories to keep him company. If you like this video, you're a sinner. We'll forgive you though if you like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.